I now call on Deputy Joan Collins, who's sharing her time with Deputies Clare Daly, Mick Wallace, Richard Boyd Barrett and Thomas Pringle. 6 minutes each.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ceann Comhairle, I think this is very welcome. We're at this stage in relation to the bill. I'd first of all like to welcome members of the trans community who are up in the gallery there today, listening intently to what's been said here. And also making the point as well that while this legislation is welcome, there's still a lot of issues in it that haven't been addressed and that I think are importantly need to be addressed, and they've been raised by a number of deputies already. And really what I prefer to see, Minister, is that you bring these amendments to the committee, not us bringing the amendments, because then they're meaningful. And that's what I'd like to see from today, and I hope that members of your own backbench encourage the government to do the same. I think after nearly 20 years of struggle, obstruction and delaying by the state, including the legal battle that took place in the courts, in the European Court of Human Rights, we're at a very significant moment. However, there are certain provisions in the bill which will drastically undermine the progress which would otherwise be achieved. And I was at the committee meetings in 2013 where members of the trans community came into that committee and very explicitly made the points around the human rights-based issue that this bill legislation should be based on, not the medical, that has to be on the principle of human rights. And I think that's where the bill falls down on seriously, and I think this has to be addressed. At that committee meetings, we didn't have any intersex voices coming in, we didn't have under-18s coming into the debate to hear what they had to say, and I think that was probably a failure of the committee in not reaching those people and seeing what they had to say. I think the chief among the concerns are the requirement for an unnecessary and invasive medical statement, the requirement that a married trans person be forced to divorce, the admission of young people under 16, onerous requirements for 17 to 18-year-olds, and the total exclusion of non-binary people. Inadequate provisions for the intersex people in the bill that have been written without properly considering their needs. And I think that it was in the initial bill and was taken out, so I think that needs to be addressed and brought back into it. The government have been repeatedly urged by trans people themselves to follow the self-determination-based models of best practice already in place in Denmark, in Argentina, and soon to be enforced in Malta. And why we're basing our legislation on UK legislation of 10 years ago, when there's more progressive and more human-based, human rights-based legislation coming in at this moment in Malta, I think is discouraging. And I think there's an opportunity still for the government to take that on board and bring that legislation in through at this stage. There appears to have been no consideration given to the example of Australia, India, Nepal, Thailand, and the UK and Germany to provide some degree of recognition of non-binary trans people. There's no satisfactory explanation has been given by the government as to why this was not done. The government does not appear to have undertaken any consultation with intersex people on this legislation, and intersex people have essentially been grouped with trans people with little thought. In the bill which has been drafted to deal with trans people as reflecting the terminology which applies to trans but not intersex people. As in light of this bill will properly address the needs of intersex people. Regarding the medical criteria in the bill, I would like to put to the government to amend the legislation on the basis of self-declaration, as articulated by Dr Philip Crowley, the HSE National Director, where he says that there be more. The HSE considers this process to be simpler, fairer, pragmatic, and may be easier to legislate for, as it takes account of both transgender and intersex people with differing background and context. The omission of the under-16s, I think, is really a letdown of this bill. Under-16s, it's hard enough for young women and young men when they're coming through puberty to deal with the issues they have to deal with every day of the week if you're in the body of a woman or a man. But to try and deal with then the fact that you've all these different ideas in your head that you're trying to deal with them, accepting that you're transgender, I think is really, really bad and has huge impacts on school in relation to schooling and growing up, and it has led to some disastrous situations. And the fact that between 16 and 18-year-olds have to get an oncologist, a psychologist. There's only 4 of them in the country, I believe, 4 to 5. They mainly based in Loughlinstown. If you even decide at 16 years of age to apply to seek an appointment with these people, it will take at least 2 years to reach, and at that stage you'd be 18 anyway. And I think it's just putting restrictions in that are not necessary. And I also believe that the question of the self-declaration is important here, very, very important here, and I think that should be brought into the legislation. And if not, that GPs should be considered as a medical person at the very, you know, if we don't accept, if you're not willing to accept a more stronger amendment. And already we know that the government have received a letter from the Irish GP group, and I also believe that the IMO have written a letter to the Minister as well recently in the last 24 hours saying that they think as well that there should be GPs not going to specialist medical people. So I think the forced divorce requirement is in the front, people's basic right, and I think that should be dealt with. Now I believe you are looking at that in relation to the family and the equality legislation that's going through, so that probably be dealt with in that way. Maybe you could come back and clarify that a bit more. Again, I'd just like to finish off by saying I'd like the government to put these amendments in. I'd like to thank the Senate for being so robust in trying to enforce the issue, and the review is going to be very, very important, and I'd like to hear specifically what you intend to put in for that review, so that it's a meaningful review and reflective of the community, the transgender community.
Deputy Daly.
Thanks, Corla. Minister, I warmly welcome the fact that the legislation is giving legal recognition for trans and intersex people for the very first time. I think it is incredibly positive that we are here discussing this issue and putting the spotlight on an important part of Irish life that never gets the recognition that it deserves, that generally remains hidden, not spoken about. And while recognising that, I have to say, wouldn't it have been great if we could come along and welcome this bill wholeheartedly and enthusiastically without having to put a but in that sentence? Because, you know, if just for once you could come along with something that we didn't have to say, do you know what, it actually isn't best practice, what you're proposing here is lagging behind what is best practice, and we're adopting something that's past its sell-by date now in other jurisdictions, and the government can turn around and say, well sure, look, it isn't the case that the glass is half empty, now we have a glass that's half full, but we want the whole glass. And I think this government has to say, why should Irish citizens always have to settle for less? It's not good enough. And I'm really appealing to the government to seriously look at the changes being proposed by TENI, that they have recommended that we can do this now. I mean, we can have a review in a year's time, in 2 years' time and so on, but why don't we listen to the voices now? It's doing it the wrong way around, and I really sincerely mean that. I think there are a number of issues which the other deputies have highlighted. The first issue is the confusion of the health issue with the legal issue, and it's a bit like what happened in the surrogacy debate in the Child and Family Relations Act, because let's be clear about this here. Medical procedures are there already. They're regulated separately, and they are utterly irrelevant for the purposes of this bill. This question here before us is one of legal identity, and there is no place whatsoever for the issue of a medical evaluation. I mean, let's look at this. The requirement now that a person would submit a statutory declaration with a certificate from a medical practitioner, defined as a psychiatrist or an endocrinologist, that person is satisfied that the person fully understands what they're saying. Now, apart from the practicalities of that and the points made by Deputy Collins that there's only 4 people allegedly who meet that criteria, and we've heard and met people who've said that their children are waiting for 4 years in some instances. So apart from the impracticality, it's absolutely insulting and patronising to suggest that people don't know what they want themselves. And this is an approach which has been bypassed in other jurisdictions and replaced by the human rights approach. People have mentioned Argentina, they've mentioned Malta. I mean, Malta is the only country other than ourselves who has the restrictive positions on abortion, but even they're ahead of us on this one. And the Yoga Carta principles, which do define and say that countries should respect and legally recognise each person's self-defined gender identity. You don't need to, somebody else to tell you who you are. That doesn't matter. It is a question of somebody, they know that for themselves, and it is a question of them having the right to exercise their self-determination. And I really hope that this point is taken on board. But if it isn't, for God's sake, extend the definition of a medical practitioner to include somebody's GP, that they don't have to come up to Dublin and see a specialist and be on a waiting list for years. I think deputies have made the points about civil partnership. It is a breach of the European Convention of Human Rights to force somebody to divorce. But the main issue I want to deal with is the question of young people. Where is our responsibility to protect and defend the rights of all children equally? It's not there. This bill means that transgender people are going to exist in Ireland, which is great, but only over the age of 16. Under the age of 16, those children will be invisible. Now, I am the parent of a teenager, and I know how shockingly hard it is for young people in today's society. But how much more difficult is that if you are a trans young person? It doesn't bear thinking about. And we had really moving testimony from a parent at the briefing that we had yesterday, where he made a very good comparison. And he said years ago, people in wheelchairs were held in institutions and nobody saw them. But society moved on, statutory requirements, wheelchair accessibility, it became a normal part of society. Transgender community now is in some ways kept silenced and out of the public domain, and we have an opportunity now to address this and bring it to where it should be, and we should adopt best practice in that regard. And I really don't see any logic whatsoever. I would say as well, we haven't got time, but you know, the government have said that it deals with intersex persons, but it actually doesn't. There's nowhere really in the bill that addresses those issues at all. And again, that is a shortfall that has to be addressed in the bill. But the last point I want to make, Minister, is to quote actually from that parent who we met yesterday. And, you know, he was saying about how difficult things were for their family and how wonderful his son was in actually being like a parent to them, because such was the lack of support that was out there. And he said, what's in front of us now, he said, is that the Irish transgender people, in particular Irish transgender children, inform this legislation. Their voices and their best interests must speak to this legislation. It must free them to live meaningful lives to their full potential and not restrict them or ignore them, as this version will. And I really hope you hear his voice.